Hey, welcome to Perspective, everybody. And we have a little different layout today. It looks a little different, and that's okay. Just work with us, okay? You know, we got Coach Drew, Dr. Andrew Blackwood. We have Julie Stautland, me, Mike Sherbino. I feel like we're going on the family trip.
We are.
And we're in the back seat of the car, you know, we're all crammed in.
As long as you're not touching me.
Yeah, don't worry.
You know, we have air between us.
Yeah, we got the line. And don't torment me, okay? No pea shooter.
I'll try not to.
You know, speaking about going on the family trip, it kind of lies in with what we want to talk about today, which is stress
Yes.
and anxiety, which none of you, I'm sure, have ever had.
Never.
No.
I'm the only one being honest.
You stress me out, Mike.
I stress you out?
You're stressing me out right now.
I've heard that, you know, because you don't know where we're going, and that's why, because I like to be in control.
Right.
And that can really stress you out, right, Julie?
Sure.
When you're not in control.
Oh, I'm a control freak. Yes.
I appreciate that. We've got it recorded, and now for sure. But we are going to talk about some serious stuff in a moment. You know, raising kids. That's not stressful. No, not by any stretch of the imagination. We're also going to talk about anxiety. And it seems like I'm causing that for everybody here today. And I'm rather quite enjoying it. You know, as you're watching today, I just want to encourage you to hang with us today because we're going to be talking, as I said, with Coach Drew. We're going to talk about anxiety. We're going to be talking about stress. And just in case you've ever dealt with it, well, you're going to hear some very practical answers on how to work through a lot of those feelings. And Andrew, seriously, we do want to welcome you today.
Thank you.
And Julie, thank you for tolerating me. Appreciate that as well. Let's just talk about anxiety. We've talked about it in different times. You've been on my radio show. You've been here on The Perspective. And it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
No, and it won't. It won't. Anxiety is a part of everyone's life. But there's a spectrum, if you will. So there are many factors that contribute to it, but a simple definition, a working definition, is a picture of the future that's negative.
A picture of the future that's negative. That's really good.
Yeah, it's a future orientation that's negative. So if you're watching a horror movie called Your Life, you're going to feel anxious, and your body can't tell the difference between what's really happening and what you're imagining. So when you see something horrible happening, you feel anxious. It's a part of our human conditioning. It's part of how we're wired. So we want to understand how that works so we can deal with the thoughts.
So what you're saying is Hollywood's not doing us any great favors when they create these movies that keep us riveted to our seat.
No, but I guess the favor is you can really relate to it. Like you watch a movie, a really good movie, and you buy into it.
Yeah.
Like it's really happening. You know, we see stars on TV and it's like we know them because we've watched them, right? It's all imaginary. Our imaginations are powerful. But the same way we can imagine horrible things, the same way we can imagine wonderful things. And I think that's what God intends, right?
And on that note, you as a mental health professional, I mean, you know, the news is overwhelming, to me at least, many times, just listening everything that's going on there, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. How do we help children be brave in the midst of turmoil, as you talk about?
Yeah, helping children be brave. That's actually the name of the online course that I offer, Help Them Be Brave. And, you know, there are several factors that contribute to people feeling anxious. And like I'm saying, when they envision something that's negative, but one of the most important things we can do when we're dealing with kids is actually to be calm.
Even if you're faking it?
Yeah. Yeah. See, well, you're unpacking something else, right? The reality is a lot of times, even as parents, when we see our children feeling anxious, we get anxious. Right. So it's important for us to know, I call it creating the roadmap to calm. We want to understand how to find this place of calm and be so familiar with getting there that we can be a good guide for our children. Because when they come into an environment, if they're anxious and then we're anxious or we're uptight or we're defensive, the only thing worse than feeling anxious is feeling ashamed for being anxious or feeling that you're not welcome. Right.
Why do they feel ashamed?
Well, because a lot of the times a natural reaction for a parent is to either reassure them or minimize, right? And it feels the same.
Right.
Oh, don't worry about that.
Don't
or you
dwell on
shouldn't worry
that.
about that.
Yeah.
When, like I said before, this child is imagining this. So what you feel, you tend to believe is real. So they're feeling this very real thing. And we're like, oh, you shouldn't be worrying about that. They're like, oh, so something's wrong with me.
And then then they might not come back to you and talk about it again.
And then they're isolated with their anxiety. They're the only one who feels this way. Nobody understands them. And then before long, anxiety rolls over into depression.
And that just creates this great chasm between parents and kids. That was actually one of the questions I had written down here is like, what are tips for parents to bridge that gap? But that is one way a parent can unintentionally create a gap.
Yeah, for sure. One of the best things parents can do, in addition to learning how to be calm themselves, is actually practice empathy, being able to relate. Because like you said.
Okay, how do you do that though with a 5-year-old? Let's talk about that.
Okay.
There's levels of anxiety, right? Okay, so sometimes it can be something that's, I'm concerned that my sweater's not going to match. That's a whole lot different than if I'm going in to get a report from the doctor.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm not trying to minimize it. I mean, I'm asking the questions.
And it's a good question. It's a very real question. So how do we, without minimizing, actually bridge that gap between you and your child whose concerns might not be as big as yours? Well, actually recognizing that what they feel. They are a completely different person. They're allowed to feel differently than you. They're supposed to feel differently than you do. So it comes back to expectations. What do you expect of this person that's in front of you? Right? Do you expect... I was telling my 3-year-old one time, I got really upset. I was like, stop jumping on the bed. I told you already. Like, you're 3 years old.
You're 3 years
that's
old.
A 3 years old, It's jumping on the bed. I expected her not
She was just doing what she saw you do.
I expected her to follow my instructions the first time around because I'm her dad. But developmentally, she's 3. Right? And people are different. When I think about people developmentally, you could be 17, but certain parts of you might be 8.
I'll have to say my one daughter, I won't say which one, I didn't know if she'd ever learned spatial awareness. Like even into her teen years, I'm like, this is a real problem.
Exactly. People are different. And
she has learned it, by the way. I will say that. She has learned it, yes.
We forget that people are different. God made us different on purpose. So modifying our expectations so that they are appropriate, that's what makes it healthy. So when you listen to a 5-year-old, you don't listen from a 45-year-old perspective. You want to be like, oh, okay, I can appreciate that. I can actually, and then you end up validating their experience so that they can actually, oh, okay, I'm not going to die. Oh, okay, this is what it feels like to be calm and in the presence of someone who's calm, even when I have a concern.
So this is for a younger child.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move it up before we go to the break. What do I do with a teenager that's overwhelmed? And I got a lot of examples right now. I think of families that are going through separation or divorce. Okay, and it's one thing how the younger one deals with it if there's 4 or 5 kids in the family, but the ones that are in high school, it's just anxiety. There's all sorts of anger, frustration, and maybe people watching, they say, well, that's not our family, but teenagers are carrying anxiety in significant ways that I never even thought about 20 years ago. Talk to us about that, Coach.
One of the beautiful things about understanding how empathy works is it actually helps you to know someone. You can't actually be helpful to someone unless you know them. And when we listen from a place of compassion and empathy, we actually start to understand where someone's coming from. So before you can pull them out of anxiety, it's almost like you get to step into them. You get to step into it with them and say, okay, so what are you actually worried about? What are you imagining that causes you to feel so afraid, right? You actually get to take the time and be with that person, right? It takes time, it takes energy, it takes empathy, but that's where the healing actually happens.
And I think it's a lot harder for people that are take charge, let's make it right, let's get her done, and to actually step back and listen and not just, and really have the opportunity to get to know.
Right. Sometimes it's personality, right? People are, but then sometimes, especially with parents, sometimes they are actually feeling anxious.
Right.
And hurry is often as a result of worry. You're so worried about your child and what they're experiencing. You want to move them through it as quick as possible. But then that robs them of the opportunity to be like, oh, you mean I don't need life to change for me to be okay? When you demonstrate that, you know what? You're okay. I'm okay. God has a plan. We don't exactly know what the plan is, but he's going to take care of us. Being able to be in the moment and to be still and know that he's God, that actually helps them navigate the anxiety better.
Very cool.
Oh, good points.
Why don't you stay with us? We're going to be right back with Coach Drew as we talk more about stress and anxiety. Folks, relax.
For those of us who follow Jesus, we have a book. It isn't a theology book. It isn't a rule book. This book is a story. The story of God and humanity. A story Jesus said he was fulfilling. This book contains poems, riddles, letters, puzzling narratives, and new ideas. Yet, throughout it all, this book is full of the breath of God. For those of us who follow Jesus, this book is a treasure. This book is a tree of life. This book is a page turner. Turn the page with us.
Welcome back. We're talking today with Coach Drew. And as always, it's a pleasure to have you here with us and nice to have you in studio. And I have to say, I wanted to talk about the fact that there's stress and we talk about the negative sides of stress, but is there a positive side to it? And if so, how do we use it to our benefit?
And how do we find it right now?
See, there's that hurry again, right? Well, I think there are a lot of things that can be stressful. And there's a difference between something that's stressful and then there's something that's traumatic. Okay, so we'll leave.
It's good to differentiate between that.
Yeah. So the big unexpected things that, really wound us, we'll leave that as traumatic, and we'll just talk about stress. So stress are the things that challenge us, right? Every stressful situation, every challenge, there's actually an opportunity. It's like a double-sided coin.
Right.
So one of the things that we want to think about is, what's the opportunity here for me? So when we start to think about our challenges and our stresses that way, it helps us to say, okay, you know what, I can actually handle this, and there's something good that's going to come out of it. So I think that's the first way to shift the mindset. And
with that mindset, I think it's interesting because we can use that towards strengthening our faith too. Because if we're like, okay, here we are in a situation, how are we going to use it to draw ourselves closer to God and trust God, and right?
Yeah, we have those opportunities. And I think because faith doesn't start and stop, right? That is a constant for us. So we get to be intentional about that, bring things in prayer to God. We're not denying things. Right. We're not pretending that it's not happening. We get to invite God and say, okay, what are you doing here? What's the opportunity for it? One of my core values is growing. Like, how can I go and grow through this? So that's, I think, one of the things that helps me anyways, dealing with stress.
So here's a question that I have. People watching today, we're all in various categories, but many people feel anxious. And they're not supposed to feel anxious. At least that's what Jesus said. And we try to understand that passage, be anxious for nothing. So does that mean I don't have enough faith? I'm not good enough. I'm not trusting enough. I'm not praying enough. But at the same point, I'm panicking. And so we hear someone's having a panic attack. What does that look like? I want you to enter into that conversation because there can be a lot of guilt and shame around this subject.
Certainly. So my take on be anxious for nothing is don't live anxious. Don't stay there.
Yeah, don't be rooted. Is that what you're saying?
Don't cultivate. Don't live from that place, because we can tend to do that. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years of helping people, there are certain thought patterns that induce anxiety, right? So if we think about things in a particular way, we're going to be anxious repetitively and we don't even know it. So there is a proactive approach to moving away from anxiety. You want to recognize, you want to understand those patterns, and you can actually shift those patterns. A simple one that, all or nothing, black and white thinking, it comes out in our language. So if you tend to use extremes like always, never, have to, can't, don't, I could go on, right?
It is interesting how just saying the word can have such a lasting impact on our psyche and how we interpret life.
They're very heavy.
Right?
Those words.
But what these words do, they do two things. One, they deprive us of the reality that we have choice. So when I say I need to do something, that means I don't actually have a choice. Right. Even when we approach, our devotional time with God, I really should, and I need to, I have to pray more. That's actually the opposite of what God wants. God wants you to want to pray, right? You get to pray. You choose to pray. I want, because people actually do want, but we're conditioned to talk about what we should and have to do and need to do. And it puts this pressure on us that actually causes us to feel that we don't have a choice. And God designed us to be able to choose. And we actually take that away from ourselves by the way that we think and the way that we speak.
And I think what you're first identifying is that we have to realize we need to talk about it and step back and see it in the first place to see how it's affecting us.
Yeah, we get to be more aware, right? It's impossible to move forward without an awareness, right? You can't change something unless you actually realize that you're doing it.
Exactly.
Right? So it's important to be aware of how we speak to ourselves and how we speak to others. And that carries over into children, especially when you're dealing with children who are struggling with anxiety. The more you tell them they need to do something, is the less capable they realize they are.
It's like sucking the life out of them, right?
I can see it change.
Yeah.
And when parents start to shift the language, then they start to see the dynamic starts to change. And it's something as simple as modifying your language, because that's the other thing that, using absolutes does. It removes moderation from one's mind and one's life. So
I can hear people asking a question though right now. And the question would be this. So we want to modify our language so we decrease anxiety for our kids, but where do we encourage them to have greater expectations than just sitting on the couch?
Well, again, you bring up expectations.
Like,
we talk
you
about
need
that.
to exercise, you need to do this.
Right. So what's the goal of a parent? Every parent, I assume, wants to produce and cultivate mature children who think and behave and take initiative on their own. It's responsibility. But when we tell them what they need to do, we're actually depriving them of taking that responsibility. So one of the things I talk to parents about is, how do you harness motivation?
Right.
There's a difference between telling someone what they have to do versus inspiring and encouraging and promoting. So when we take control in situations, I have this little this diagram that I share with parents, right? There's a risk ratio.
Okay.
When the risk to harm, whether it's to property, yourself, or others, is high, the imminent risk, that's not a time to negotiate.
No, you're right.
That's when you jump in, right? If a child is running into the street in oncoming traffic, it's not time to say, I think it's a good idea for you to come back. No, that's when you jump in. But if the child isn't cleaning their room, okay, nobody's going to die.
You're right.
Right?
Okay, mom might have a hard time with it, but you're right.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm just saying when every time you come across something like you're a hammer, but not every situation is like hammer worthy, right? Maybe it's just about a conversation. Like, there's so many different approaches. And when parents actually they start to dial it down, the kids pick up right away. Parents come back, they're telling me like, you're doing something different. What's going on? And they're puzzled. They're caught off guard. But then things start to shift.
Let me ask you, is that part of what you would have put under the ultimate esteem booster category? Talk about that.
Okay, I know people are really curious about what does it mean to boost esteem. We talk to people all the time, but a lot of the times we're not intentional with our language.
Yeah.
So when we, out of concern, are telling our kids what to do all the time, we're not really acknowledging who they are and the value that God made them. Like, He made them unique and wonderful. And, the same thing that we do when we see them doing something wrong, we catch them in the act and we correct them. This flips the script on that. Catch them in the act of doing something that's wonderful and that's good. And then you speak to them about who they are in light of that. I do it with my girls, and they just melt. They just beam. So my daughters are in the car. I'm driving them to school, and I was saying, to my eldest, this is what's going to happen. And, we're not going to have time for this. And she was trying to negotiate. And then her sister jumped in and she's just like, but Dad, I think you should let her. I think it's really important. It's fair.
2 against 1 here.
It was. They were teaming up on me. And I was just like, I love how supportive you are for your sister. I was like, that's the second time in 2 days when you jumped in and started to advocate for your sister.
It's cool to see that
It
develop,
is.
right?
And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. I love that. And then I could see in the background, the elder one reached over and she hugged her younger sister. And it was just this moment.
You sure they're not in cahoots together?
Either way, I'll take it, right?
Exactly.
I've seen enough sibling rivalry and fighting to know that, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. So when we catch them and we actually acknowledge, God made you supportive. And I love that about you.
Yeah.
It affirms them in a very deep way that they realize, oh, that is who I am.
Andrew, we're almost out of time.
Oh, man, I love that.
Best thought on dealing with anxiety. Give us one to go with.
Oh, I think parents are divinely positioned to support the emotional needs of their children. So you're there on purpose. Even if you feel anxious as a parent, you can actually relate to how challenging that can be. And when you can do that, your child isn't alone.
Good words.
Excellent.
Thanks, Coach, for being with us. Look forward to having you back again.
Always a pleasure.
Always.
Stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back.
Love the conversation we had with Coach Drew. And as we talked about stress and anxiety can often be triggers to cause us to choose to compromise. This week, we were talking about the whole subject of integrity. And what happens when you're under stress? Have you ever compromised who you are, the things that you believe in? I want you to know that God is there to forgive us, that today can be a fresh start. But forewarned is forearmed. And I want to take us back to the Old Testament, the story we were looking at yesterday about a lady named Ruth. Remember, she was the Moabite lady, and her husband died, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, her husband had died. And here were these two women, one older, one younger, and they're going back to Bethlehem. Ruth is going back somewhat as a refugee, wondering what's going to happen. But she's made a choice that she's going to follow after the God of Naomi. They want to get back on track. They want to get back to a place where they think they can have a fresh beginning. But, being a refugee, being impoverished, and being with an elderly mother-in-law, it's not a good recipe for success. And you can take all those things and the things that you're dealing with in your life, and it's very easy to say, hey, you know what? I got to cut the corner. I got to do what I got to do and then go on from there. Remember one day I was speaking at Toronto's infamous Don Jail. And afterwards, one of the men in custody spoke to me and he said, preacher, he said, I believe what you say. And he said, I'm going to follow Jesus, but I'm going to get out of here and pull one more job and then I'm going to go straight. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but I sure appreciated his honesty. Because many times we don't want to face the reality that we are choosing to be someone who we really don't want to be. Ruth is in that situation. And what we find out is that integrity calls out when no one is looking. Do you remember that we talked yesterday? The story is starting to change. The mood is picking up. It's just a short little book, but now we're halfway through it. And in the book of Ruth, things are starting to pick up. Maybe there's a ray of sunshine that they were able to see. And what happens is it's harvest time. And as I explained yesterday, there's a strange custom where if you realize that you had a relative, and Ruth and Naomi, their next of kin, had died, but God had given a provision that was called the kinsman redeemer, that the next of kin was to take care of a widow and to provide for her if he was able. And if he couldn't do it, he passed it on to the next closest relative. And so what Naomi counsels Ruth to do is that late at night, when the harvesting is done for the day, she's to go and to lie at the feet of Boaz. And as she lies at his feet, she's to wait there. And Boaz wakes up startled in the middle of the night, and he sees a woman there. And Ruth says, will you take care of me because I am your next of kin? And he actually compliments her that she hasn't taken advantage of him in that situation. And what is interesting is that he didn't take advantage of her. And we read in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 9, an interesting verse where he says, all of my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. What an incredible statement, that she was known. She already had a reputation. And folks, our reputation goes before us. The reputation about Boaz was that he was a worthy man as well. But it is so easy to compromise. It is so easy to give in to the temptation in the moment. I want to encourage you to draw on the power and strength of the Holy Spirit to be the man, the woman that he calls us to be, even in the midst of difficult situations. You know, Tuesday dawned cold at the launch site, yet some distance away from Cape Canaveral. On that icy morning, the air was filled with a heated debate. Unknown to the rest of the world, there was a war of words that was taking place behind the scenes. The verbal battle was between clear-thinking engineers and technicians who were on one side of the argument, but there were the influential executives and image-conscious bureaucrats who were saying yes on the other. And the argument was over the Space Shuttle Challenger, whether it should be launched that morning on January 28, 1986. And against the strong advice of experts who knew the temperature had dropped too low for the launch to be considered safe, the countdown continued right up to liftoff. And 70 seconds later, to the horror of the nation, the Challenger's crew of 7 perished in a mammoth explosion. And debris rained for a full hour. Technicians pinpointed the cause of the explosion as a faulty seal that allowed volatile fuel to leak and ignite. That was the technical explanation. But the real reason for Challenger's explosion went deeper than the breakdown of an O-ring. It began with the breakdown of integrity, both in the construction of the shuttle and in the character of those who refused to heed the warning. We can learn that lesson, or we can choose to ignore it. We can learn from Ruth. We can choose to ignore it. But the good news is that God is inviting you and I to be people who are different, people of integrity.